Hey folks, I wasn't sure whether or not I should do this video, but then I decided that a lot of young people in college are watching my videos, so I want to give this information out for those people that are interested in a career in the law, specifically how to get into the top law schools, the top 6 law schools, top 10 law schools in the United States, which really makes a huge difference for most people as to where their career goes. Because by getting into these top 6 law schools, arguably maybe the top 10, it really opens up doors that are generally speaking not available for people that go to other law schools. That's just the harsh reality. And by those opportunities, I mean to work at the largest law firms in the country, where starting salaries for a 20-something-year-old lawyer is well over $200,000 a year, plus signing bonuses. And I should let you know that the current signing bonus, as I understand it, this is not the salary, this is the signing bonus for a individual that has just clerked for the United States Supreme Court, has now reached about $500,000 for a signing bonus if you clerk for the U.S. Supreme Court. And again, the usual way to get these jobs is to go through the top law schools, which is why I just want to talk for a few minutes about how you get into some of these programs, my recommendations for it that I give to students that are trying to get into these kind of programs. And again, this video may not be for everyone, but for anyone that wants to hear some of the inside tips about getting into the big law schools that give rise to a lot of the people we talk about, the famous judges, the Supreme Court justices, the lawyers that are arguing for the Supreme Court, and so on and so on. If you want to hear about some of the inside tips about how you get into positions where you can ultimately advance to that level in the legal profession, stay tuned. You're not going to want to miss these inside geeky details about applying to the elite law schools and what it means for your career. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the 4 Boxes Diner, proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the U.S. Supreme Court Bar, and author of many books, including Disarmed: What the Ukraine War Teaches Americans About the Right to Bear Arms. All right, folks, so there's something on the order of magnitude of maybe 1.3 million lawyers in the United States, of too many lawyers, but that's a whole different issue. I think the problem is not that there's too many lawyers, it's there are too many laws. I'd like to cut all that back, but I'm not in charge right now. So with that said, there's a very, very, very small subset of lawyers that actually engage in constitutional litigation and go to these, work at some of these elite law firms that you may have read about in the paper. Like I started off at Skadden Arps, which, you probably have read, I'm sure you haven't read any of the books about them, but there are books out there on the importance of Skadden Arps in the legal profession over the years. And that's where I started my career after a federal clerkship. But anyway, to get into these positions, it's very difficult because there's really only a few pathways to get to these positions. Mostly this is through the elite law schools. Now, I'm just going to break some of this stuff down. Then we're going to talk about how you can possibly improve your chances to get into these schools with some of the things I've seen work over the years. To begin with, there are really the elite 6 law schools, the highest, the best law schools, the most elite law schools. I know you can have a debate about this, 6 ways to Sunday, but I think overall it's pretty well established that the top 6 law schools in the United States in terms of prestige are Harvard, Yale, NYU, Columbia, Stanford, and Chicago. And then there's a sort of a second tier there consisting of schools like Michigan, Duke, Berkeley, UVA, Georgetown, schools like that. And then, of course, it goes on from there. There's about 160 law schools in the United States, and they all have something excellent to provide to people depending on where you want to be in your career down the road. But if you want to get the traditional elite lawyer approach, which is you go to the big law school, you then get one of these jobs at one of the top 50 bold-faced law firms in the United States with $200,000 a year starting salary, or you try to get a federal clerkship and then you try to get the U.S. Supreme Court with, again, a signing bonus today of around $500,000 once you leave the clerkship to go work for a law firm. If you want to get into that path, you really, as a general matter, do want to get into one of these elite schools, if at all possible. So how do you do that? Well, I'm going to start with the most basic black and white kind of objective ways of doing it, and then we're going to talk about some nuanced ways to improve your chances. The basic way at the bottom line is really, I would say, almost a necessary condition for almost all people, is that you need to have an extremely high GPA in college and extremely high LSAT, which is, of course, the legal aptitude test. It's the SAT for lawyers, if you will. The test you on logical reasoning, logic games, reading comprehension, and so on. But let's just start with the GPA. This varies depending a little bit on the major, but the bottom line is you want to get as close as possible, into the 3.8, 3.9s, 4.0s. It was a little bit lower when I was applying because I don't think there was as much grade inflation, but now there's a lot of grade inflation. So you really want to, which means that people are just, handing out A's like candy. A lot of these professors, that was not always the case, but that's kind of the case in a lot of universities now. So you really do want to get, 3.7 and above as a general matter in terms of your GPA, step one. Then and this is very important, keep in mind that 4 years of college gives rise to a GPA, but it's a 3-hour some odd test, the LSAT, which is the equivalent in many respects or equally balanced with a 4 years of work. So think about that for 1 second, how weird that is. You got 4 years goes into a GPA, and then you have 3-hour test, the LSAT, which in many respects is worth more than your GPA because it really is allowing the universities, the law schools, to measure how you do against everyone else in all these other schools across the country. So the LSAT is extremely important. And what I like to advise students is this. I say the LSAT is worth half of the initial weight of your application, and the GPA from college is worth the other half to start with. Now, this LSAT, you really want to get well above the 95th percentile, as close to the 99th percentile as possible, I'd recommend. But as long as you're 95th, 96th percentile or above, you're where you want to be. And what that means in a given year of all the people, of all the thousands and thousands of college graduates or college students that are taking the LSAT, you want to have beaten out in terms of your test score over 95% of the people that took the test. So if you have a high GPA and you've beaten out over 95% of the people that take the LSAT that year, that puts you into a pretty good chance to fall into what I'm going to call one of the critical 3 buckets. Now, to step back for a second, there are 3 buckets in an admissions committee. A lot of the colleges and law schools work the same way. There's 3 buckets. They take the LSAT score, and they take the GPA, and they combine that with an internal weighted average number of some sort, and then they put you into one of 3 buckets internally. They either put you into the presumed admit bucket, which means that we're likely going to admit you unless there's something weird or problematic about your background that we haven't had a chance to look at yet. So you want to be in the presumed admit bucket. Then there's the presumed you're not going to get in bucket, the presumed denied bucket, which means you're unlikely going to get into the school unless there's something extraordinary about you or something unique about you that really will allow them to draw it up. That usually doesn't occur. Then there is the middle of the pack, which is kind of people that maybe could get in, maybe don't, maybe cannot get in. It's really unclear, and they're going to really have to look at your application in total to make a final decision, which gives rise to the second part. So again, in a perfect world, you really want to have a high LSAT score and GPA to get into the presumed admit bucket. That's where you want to be with these elite law schools. Now, let's carry on. There are 2 other important things that have to be considered that will allow you to maybe bump up or improve your chances to get into the big law schools. That is your personal statement and recommendations from people that are recommending you, like professors. Let's talk briefly about your personal statement. Again, all of the advice I'm giving is very general here. Everybody has a unique background. Everyone has unique skill sets and unique experiences that they can draw from. So I'm just giving you some general observations to think about. When you actually apply, you have to do what's best for you, given where you come from, because I can't specifically advise a particular person without knowing all the facts. So I'm just giving you some general guidance, which I think is generally okay here. So when it comes to your personal statement, this is the only advice I give to students about the personal statement, other than it has to be well written, no errors, and so on, and things like that, obviously. If you're trying to get into these big law schools, it is not enough to argue that you want to be a lawyer. Do you see why? Because if I simply write a personal statement that says, I've always wanted to be a lawyer, and therefore I want to go to your law school, well, you can make that argument with any law school in the United States. And an elite law school like a Harvard or NYU is going to be like, okay, well, if you just want to be a lawyer, you can go to any law school. Why do you need to come to our law school where we're highly selective? Go to some other law school. You can be a lawyer through any of these 160 some odd law schools. Why do you need to come to our law school? And that's the key to the personal statement, in my opinion, that you really want to argue to the law school that you need to get into that particular law school for a particular reason, that if you don't get into the law school, you're not going to be able to achieve your personal and or professional goals in life. So for example, if you want to, like a classic example I talk to students about, assuming you have the background and qualifications for this, is to apply to these elite law schools and say, look, I really want to be a law professor, or I want to be a Supreme Court clerk, or I want to be a scholar. These are very rarefied things to do in the legal profession. They're very difficult to get these high-end jobs. And again, you can say to the big law schools that for me to accomplish for me to get where I want to get in the profession, I really need to go to your law school, because your law school will serve as a platform that will launch me to those professions. And if I don't get into a law school like your law school, I'm not going to be able to achieve my personal and professional goals. That's the kind of argument you want to be making as a general matter in your personal statement that I have found, generally speaking, works better than just a generic, I want to be a lawyer and I want to go to law school, so I want to go to your law school, because again, the law school could be like, well, you can go to any law school. Why do you need us in particular? And the elite law schools, the Harvards and the NYUs and the Columbias of the world really want to hear, why do you need to come to our law school, and as opposed to just any law school? So keep that in mind with your personal statement. Now, letters of recommendation. This is going to be something a little outside of the box, but I know what I'm talking about here. It is very important, in my opinion, that you know what these recommenders are going to be arguing and that you actually see the draft letters of recommendation before they're submitted. This is even if the law schools say that you're not supposed to see their recommendations and stuff like that. Don't believe them. The reality is this, in my opinion, that if you're working with professors that don't understand how the game is played and how people get into these big-time programs, and they're unwilling to show you their letter of recommendation, I'm not saying you should not use those professors, but I would be very leery about it, because in my experience, it's very important that the applicant and the professors all see each other's letters and recommendations to make sure they're entirely consistent. Because the last thing you want to be doing is that you write something in your personal statement that says you want to do X, for example, and then your recommenders say that Mark is going to be great at doing something other than X. In other words, if I write this letter that says all I want to do is do, public interest litigation, for example, and then my recommenders say in their letters he's going to be the best Wall Street M&A lawyer on the planet, you see that disconnect is the sort of thing that law school admissions committees will look at, and they may ding you on the grounds that, guess what? There's some problem with the application, this inconsistency. To avoid that, you want to make sure that you see your letters of recommendation, if at all possible, to make sure that everything lines up and there are no red flags created. The other thing is, if they're unwilling to show you a letter of recommendation, your professor, whoever's writing it, in addition to the fact, in my opinion, it shows that they don't understand how the process really works in the real world. The other thing to keep in mind is they may be saying something that's not great about you. And the last thing you want is for someone to write a letter of recommendation that says something like that. Well, little Jimmy, not that smart. It took like 3 years for him to figure out how to get through college. He finally kind of turned it around somewhat, and I'm glad to recommend him for your law school. Well, you get some sort of tepid, crappy recommendation like that. That's going to kill you in most instances, and that's why you want to kind of see this stuff so you really know that kind of stuff is not going on. Because if you see a draft recommendation like that, you know that you can't submit it, because it's going to kill your application at most of the top law schools and probably at most law schools. So again, these are just some of the things you want to keep in mind. So I just want to wrap up with this. The traditional way, and again, there are always exceptions. There are ways to get ahead, to make a lot of money, to be successful and become a constitutional lawyer and all this fancy stuff. There's a lot of ways to skin the cat in the legal profession. Okay, so this is not a one size fits all situation. I'm just telling you the traditional way it usually can work. The easiest way to get to where you want to be is what I'm describing. But the traditional way is, once you get into these top law schools, you try to make the law review or a law journal, and then after that you apply for a federal clerkship, possibly a state Supreme Court clerkship, but generally speaking, you want a federal clerkship for a year. After that federal clerkship, you then want to go to a very prestigious law firm for a couple years. Those law firms tend to be the top 50 or 60 law firms out of New York and D.C. and so on. They're places like where I started my career, Skadden Arps in New York. These big-time firms that are world-renowned. If you can get into those firms, because again, it's on your resume forever. So you really want a federal clerkship with a judge for a year or so. Then you want a big firm, experienced experience for a couple years so you can, at a minimum, say you did it. And then from there, you can start to figure out where you want to go next. If you want to go be a lawyer for the government, if you want to go to a smaller firm, if you want to stay and try to make partner to the big firm, and all of these things are available to you. But again, if you don't start down this path, it's very difficult to go from a different part of the legal profession to start off at your career and then move into these heights. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's a much more difficult and a lot easier to go the other direction, which means, big law school, federal clerkship, big law firm experience, and then from there, go to where you feel like you ultimately want to get to. Start your own firm, become a PI lawyer, whatever it is that you want to do. Again, it's harder to do the reverse, and that's why I always urge people to try to get into the best law school they can to maximize their chances of that sort of a legal process. Again, there's a lot of ways to be a successful lawyer. This is not the only way to skin the cat, but again, I want to give you some of this inside information because I'm uniquely situated to give you some of this guidance because of my experience and who I work with on a daily basis. So I happen to know some of this information that is not readily accessible if you just crack open a general book about how to apply to a law school. And that's why I wanted to shoot this video, almost like a little bit of a public service here to young students that are looking down the chessboard to go to law school and go beyond that. Again, there's a lot of other ways to become successful in the United States without becoming a professional, without becoming a lawyer. So this video is really designed to people that want to be lawyers. But again, there's a lot of ways to be very successful and to help things like the Second Amendment movement and the Constitution without ever going to law school. But if you want to go to law school, keep in mind some of the things I mentioned here today. I think it will help you in your application process. And Godspeed to all who want to do this. All right, folks, hope you learned something here today. I know this was a little bit off the beaten path. We'll get back to the Second Amendment soon enough. And don't forget to subscribe, and we will see you again soon here at the Four Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.